Welcome to today's story, Gravity of the Unknown, generated by StoryWave.ai, March 2024. Please tap that like button, share, and subscribe for more. Chapter 1, Silent Whispers. The haunting glow of Europa's icy crust loomed large in the port window, a silent sentinel in the void. A shiver coursed down my spine, not from the cold, our habitat module was climate-controlled, but from the raw uncertainty that this alien world exuded. Today, we stood on the brink of a cosmic revelation, a truth veiled beneath miles of ice, in the ocean of this distant moon. But with every discovery comes a price, and ours was yet to be determined. Kent, our commander, called a meeting in the main observatory, his blue eyes reflecting the stark white of Europa's surface. He exuded an aura of control, the kind that made you believe in the impossible. "Team, we've stumbled upon something extraordinary," Kent began, his voice steady as the hum of our life support systems. "Sensors have detected unique biosignatures in the ocean below." Laura, our science officer, perked up, her rimless glasses catching the light as she leaned forward. "The readings are unlike any extremophile signatures we've encountered on Earth," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and trepidation. Paul, the medical officer, stroked his mustache thoughtfully. His voice, usually a calming balm, bore a hint of concern. "We must consider the risks of contamination. Whatever life forms dwell in those waters, they evolved without any contact from terrestrial species." Jin, always with her locket, chimed in melodiously. "Communications with Earth will take hours for a round trip. We're on our own for now." The group fell into a heavy silence, the weight of our isolation as palpable as the ice above us. John, the first man and our deft pilot, broke the stillness. "I say we investigate. This is what we came for, isn't it? To push boundaries?" His green eyes sparked with the same fervor that had earned him the tattoo of Europa on his arm, a permanent testament to his dedication to this mission. We debated back and forth, the excitement of the unknown wrestling with the protocol that safeguarded our lives. The risks of a dive were manifold, the pressure, the cold, the alien environment. But the lure of discovery was overpowering. As the conversation ebbed and flowed around the observatory, I felt tension coil within me, a serpent lurking in the pit of my stomach. I had joined this mission to be part of history, to touch the face of the unknown, and now it beckoned to me, whispered promises of secrets hidden in the abyss. In a moment of quiet, when the others were lost in thought, I made my decision. I would not wait for consensus or permission. I would dive into Europa's ocean, into the heart of mystery itself. I slipped away, unnoticed, my conviction as hard as the ice beneath my feet. Securing a submersible suit, I approached the airlock. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the gravity of my actions. With each step, I moved closer to the precipice of the unknown, propelled by an insatiable curiosity that had always been my driving force. The outer door opened with a hiss, and I descended into the depths, a solitary figure against the vast expanse of ice and ocean. The blue-green light of Europa's sea enveloped me, and I felt simultaneously insignificant and part of something monumental. Below, in the crushing silence of the deep, I found what we had been searching for, what had set our hearts racing and minds reeling. The biosignatures, a tapestry of life unlike any on Earth, danced before my eyes. I reached out, a gesture of connection across the void of space and species. But as I touched the alien forms, my joy was short-lived. A warning klaxon blared in my suit, and I felt a sharp sting at my fingertips. Panic rose like a tide as I realized the price of my impetuous descent. What had I unleashed? What contagion had I invited into our midst? The ascent was a blur, my thoughts a racket of fear and regret. As I emerged, the faces of my crew were a mix of shock and dismay. Kent's authoritative baritone broke through my daze. "What have you done?" he demanded, his calm demeanor shattered by the gravity of my actions. I had no answer for him, only silent whispers of apology that were lost in the chaos that ensued. As the reality of our predicament set in, I knew that our greatest hope had become our deepest desolation. Chapter 2, Beneath the Ice. Europa's icy shell concealed wonders and terrors in equal measure, as I was about to learn. The submersible's retrieval from the depths had brought with it a finding that could rewrite the boundaries of biology, a life form thriving in the cold, dark ocean, its structure alien to our understanding of life. Paul, our medical officer, stood in the lab, his eyes scrutinizing the containment unit where the specimen floated, a specter in the water. He had aged more in these hours of discovery than in all our time in space, his brow furrowed with the weight of responsibility. "We must establish quarantine measures immediately," Paul asserted, his voice steady, but the glint in his eye betrayed his urgency. "None of us know what this organism is capable of." Kent nodded, his demeanor echoing the severity of the situation. "Agreed. No one enters or leaves this lab without Paul's clearance. Is that understood?" Murmurs of agreement echoed through the room, though the excitement that once sparkled in our eyes had dulled, replaced by a cautious glint. Laura hovered by the containment unit, her gaze fixed on the sample. The cellular structure is unlike anything we've known. It's as if it's not just surviving in Europa's ocean, it's thriving because of it. Jin, adjusting the communications headset that seldom left her head, spoke up. "I've sent the preliminary data to Earth, but it'll be a while before we get any directives." The silence that followed was thick, a fog of anticipation and dread. The vast expanse of Europa's ocean seemed to press against the walls of the station, a reminder of the unknown that lay just beyond. As days melded into nights, with no sun to mark the passage of time, the first sign appeared. John, our steely pilot, began to cough, a dry sound that scraped the silence. His rugged frame shuddered with each convulsion, and the tattoo on his arm seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. "It's nothing," he said, waving off our concern. "Just a tickle in my throat." But Paul's eyes narrowed, his medical instinct sounding silent alarms. "I want you in the infirmary for observation. No arguments." John's protest was cut short by another coughing fit, and he allowed himself to be led away, his usual confidence replaced by a vulnerability we had never seen. In the infirmary, Paul became a sentinel, monitoring John's every breath, every shift in temperature. The rest of us hovered at the periphery, our tasks a distraction from the concern that knotted our stomachs. Laura's voice broke the silence, her words a whisper of fear. What if the organism is pathogenic? What if John's condition is just the beginning? Kent placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to reassure. "We'll handle it. We've faced challenges before." But this was unlike any challenge we had encountered. This was an adversary we could not see, a threat that defied our understanding of the world. The hours ticked by, and with each one, the station seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in. The biosignatures that had once been a source of wonder now cast a shadow over us, a specter of what could be. I found myself gazing out the port window, the ice of Europa, a silent witness to our plight. The whispers of the unknown seemed louder now, a chilling reminder of the price of curiosity. As I watched, a crack appeared in the ice, a fissure that spread and branched like the veins of a leaf. I realized, with a start, that it mirrored the fissures of doubt that spread through our crew. We were explorers, pioneers on the final frontier, but now we faced an enemy from within, hidden in the very discovery we had sought. And as the first signs of infection crept subtly among us, I wondered if our mission of hope had become a prelude to tragedy, the whispers of excitement now silent in the face of an encroaching horror. Chapter 3: Invisible Foe. A stillness had fallen over the Europa station, a calm that belied the storm brewing within its walls. The once vibrant hum of activity had dimmed, and in its place lingered a silence that spoke volumes. We were at an impasse, the virus a specter that had infiltrated our ranks, its symptoms now manifesting in one of our own. Seated at the communal dining area, the tension among us was palpable. Kent, with his commanding presence, attempted to maintain a semblance of order, but the strain was evident in the tightness of his jaw. "We need to remain focused," Kent said, his blue eyes scanning the faces of his crew. "The quarantine zone has been established. We stick to the protocols." Laura, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, stood opposite him, her stance resolute. "The protocols were enacted too late. We need to consider the possibility of exposure for all of us." Kent's brow furrowed, his voice firm. "We've taken every precaution since the discovery. There's no need to incite panic." Laura's reply was swift, her hazel eyes flashing. "Panic? Kent, look around. The virus is not just a theory anymore. It's here, and we're not prepared." The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the situation pressing down upon us. Paul had been tirelessly working in the lab, the lines on his face deepening with each passing hour as he monitored the afflicted crew member, John, who had grown alarmingly pale and weak. I found myself gazing at the stars beyond the viewport, wondering if the answers we sought were out there, just beyond our reach. The silence was broken by Jin's soft voice, her usual optimism subdued. Earth's last transmission advised caution, but they can't fathom what we're facing here, she said, her brown eyes reflecting the starlight. The conversation went back and forth, a verbal tug-of-war that mirrored the battle waging within our bodies. Were we fighting a losing battle against an invisible foe? As we deliberated, the station's systems continued their unending chorus, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. The air recyclers hummed, and the artificial gravity held us firmly to the floor, a cruel mimicry of the Earth we had left behind. In the midst of our debate, a chilling realization dawned upon me. The virus had not only breached our physical defenses, but had begun to erode the trust and camaraderie that bound us together. We were a crew unraveling at the seams, our mission's purpose now overshadowed by the need for survival. The hours slipped by, and with each tick of the clock, the situation grew more dire. John's condition worsened, his breaths coming in shallow gasps, a marked difference to the robust vitality he once possessed. Paul emerged from the infirmary, his features drawn, his voice barely above a whisper. His symptoms are accelerating. We need to act now. Kent, who had always been the rock we leaned upon, seemed to falter under the weight of his responsibility. What do you suggest? Laura stepped forward, her expression grave. We have to consider the possibility that we've all been exposed. The quarantine measures might not be enough. The room fell into a heavy silence, each of us lost in the gravity of our predicament. The virus, an enemy we could not see or touch, had sown seeds of chaos among us, and I could not shake the feeling that our fate had already been sealed. As I retired to my bunk, the walls of my quarters closing in, the whisper of Europa's winds against the station's exterior felt like a lament. The invisible foe had breached our defenses, and as I drifted into a restless sleep, the rising tension of our tragic predicament clung to my thoughts, a haunting prelude to the unknown dangers that lay ahead. Chapter 4. Abandoned. The silence from Earth was deafening. The communications panel, once alive with the chatter from Mission Control, now stared back at us with a blank indifference. We were cut off, adrift in the cold expanse of space, the umbilical cord to our home planet severed without warning. In the common area, the crew gathered, their faces etched with concern. Kent was at the communications console, his fingers dancing over the controls in a futile attempt to elicit a response. His usual calm was a facade that was beginning to crack. "We have to keep trying," Kent said, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. "Earth can't just leave us out here, not without." "Without what, Kent? Without a goodbye?" Laura interrupted, her tone sharp. There was an edge to her voice that I had never heard before. "We need to face the possibility that we're on our own." Jin, who had always been the thread connecting us to Earth, slumped in her chair, the locket around her neck a heavy reminder of the world she longed for. The last transmission was cut mid-sentence. It's like they just disappeared. Paul leaned against the bulkhead, his eyes scanning the dwindling supply levels on the digital display. If we're truly isolated, we need to consider rationing our resources. This practical suggestion was a stark reminder of our predicament. John, though still weak, managed to sit up, his voice a hoarse whisper. Rationing won't mean a thing if we don't figure out what this virus is doing to us. The room erupted into a tumult of voices, each one layered with fear and frustration. The crew's morale, once high, was plunging as quickly as our hopes. "We have enough food and water to last for months," I offered, trying to inject a note of optimism into the bleak conversation. "We're trained for situations like this." Kent nodded, his eyes meeting mine. "That's right. We need to stay focused and maintain order. Panic won't help us." But the opinion felt hollow, a bandage over a wound too deep to heal. The sense of betrayal, the abandonment by Earth, was a chasm that threatened to swallow us whole. In a last-ditch effort, we sent an emergency transmission, our collective breath held as we waited for the ping of acknowledgement. But there was nothing. The silence returned, a void that echoed the hollowness inside us. As we dispersed to our assigned tasks, the station felt larger, the walls stretching with the expanse of our isolation. The very air seemed to taunt us with the freedom we had lost, each breath a reminder of our dependence on the systems that sustained us. The day wore on, marked only by the routine checks and the occasional sound of Jin's attempts to reach Earth. The hours passed with no reply, each tick of the clock a nail in the coffin of our hope. The emergency rations were distributed, each package a meager offering that underscored our predicament. We ate in silence, the taste of the food as bland as our prospects. As I lay in my bunk that night, the darkness was a shroud that wrapped around me. The tension of our tragic circumstance was a palpable force, a current that ran through the station, through each of us. The whispers of Europa outside were a haunting melody to the symphony of our despair. Betrayed, isolated, and slowly succumbing to an invisible foe, we were a crew clinging to the remnants of our mission. And as I closed my eyes, the tragic cliffhanger of our story loomed over me, a specter in the silence of space. Chapter 5: Desperate Measures. The stark expanse of Europa's surface stretched out before us, a tapestry of ice that both beckoned and threatened. We had known scarcity before, but the dwindling supplies in our base were a silent scream that echoed off every wall, a countdown to an end we weren't prepared to meet. We stood together, the remaining crew, in the shadow of the decision that would define our fate. "We've got to find water," Kent said, gazing through the thick glass of the observatory. His athletic build, usually a symbol of strength, seemed smaller against the vastness outside. Jin, her fingers interlaced tightly around her locket, nodded. "The ice could hold what we need, but it's not just a walk in the park." I grabbed my gear, the weight familiar yet somehow heavier with the burden of our purpose. "We've trained for this. We can do it." Laura, her eyes focused and determined behind her glasses, added, "I'll come with. We might find something out there that could help with the virus." Paul, whose features had grown more drawn with each passing day, glanced at the medical bay where our fallen crewmate lay. "Be careful. We can't afford to lose anyone else." John, though still recovering from his encounter with the virus, stepped forward. "I'm going too. I have to," he said, his voice rough but resolute. Kent hesitated, the lines on his face deepening. "It's risky, John. You're not at full strength." John's green eyes met Kent's with a fire that had nothing to do with fever. "Exactly why I need to do this, to prove I can still contribute." The trek outside was a silent one. Our suits shielded us from the lethal cold, but nothing could protect us from the uncertainty that lay beneath our feet. The ice crunched under our boots, a constant reminder of Europa's indifference to our plight. We reached a particularly treacherous expanse, the ice here a maze of jagged peaks and hidden crevasses. "Careful," Laura warned, her voice a crackle in my earpiece as she surveyed the landscape. One wrong step and her warning came too late. A shelf of ice gave way beneath John's feet, and he plummeted out of sight. "John," I shouted, rushing to the edge. Kent was already in action, securing a line to a sturdy outcropping. "I'm going after him." "No, I'll go," I insisted. "You're needed here in case I didn't come back." The unsaid words hung in the air, but Kent nodded, and I rappelled down into the cold darkness after John. The crevasse was a whispering gallery of echoes, the ice reflecting our headlamps in a kaleidoscope of eerie light. I found John on a narrow ledge, his suit compromised, the oxygen indicator blinking an ominous red. "Hang on, John," I called, securing him to my line. "We're getting out of here." His response was a weak cough, but he managed a nod, and together we ascended back into the harsh light of Europa's surface. With John in tow, we collected the ice samples, each one a potential lifeline. The journey back to the base was a march of triumph and trepidation, our haul a heavy burden that represented hope as much as survival. Once inside, John was rushed to the infirmary. Paul worked over him, a symphony of medical precision, but the toll on John's body was evident. We gathered, waiting for news, the silence a heavy shroud. Paul finally emerged, his face ashen. "He's stable, for now," but it was close, too close. Kent's gaze met mine, a silent exchange that spoke volumes of the risks we had taken and the risks still to come. That night, as I lay in my bunk, the base around me felt more like a tomb than ever. The perilous journey outside had yielded results, but at what cost? The tension of our tragic situation was a crescendo that built with each labored breath John took in the infirmary. We had faced the icy jaws of Europa and returned, but the invisible foe within our walls was a predator of a different kind, and it was waiting, biding its time. As sleep finally claimed me, I couldn't shake the feeling that our desperate measures had only delayed the inevitable. Chapter 6: Duty versus Survival. The Europa base, once a radar of human achievement, now felt like a mausoleum, cold and unyielding. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptics and fear, a vivid disparity to the sterile environment we had strived to maintain. In the infirmary, the steady beep of the heart monitor was a metronome counting down the moments of tranquility we had left. Paul hovered over the infected crew member, his every movement precise, but his eyes betrayed the growing dread. "We're running low on antivirals," he said, the gravity of his words hanging in the air like the distant stars outside. Kent, standing firm, his arms crossed as if to hold himself together, replied, "We have to keep trying." "We can't give up on him," Laura interjected, her voice steady. "Our supplies are limited. We need to think about the rest of the crew, too." The debate that unfolded was a tempest that matched the chaos of our predicament. Morality clashed with practicality, the duty we felt to our fellow crew member warring with the instinct to preserve ourselves. "We can synthesize more medication," I suggested, trying to bridge the divide. "There has to be a way to do both." "Synthesis takes time, resources," Laura countered, her face a mask of conflict. "And what if the rest of us get sick in the meantime?" Kent paced the room, his footsteps echoing the turmoil within us all. We took an oath to look after each other. "We can't abandon that now." Jin sat in silence, her usual warmth eclipsed by the shadow of our dire situation. "What if Earth has given up on us?" she whispered, her words almost lost to the whir of the life support systems. The tension was palpable, a living entity that coiled around us, constricting our thoughts, our ability to reason. We were at a crossroads. The path ahead forked and shrouded in uncertainty. An emergency medical procedure was our last resort, a gamble that Paul was willing to take. With meticulous care, he administered the treatment, a cocktail of hope and desperation. We watched with bated breath, each second stretching into eternity as we waited for a sign of improvement. But instead of the recovery we so desperately sought, the monitor's rhythm faltered, the steady beeps dissolving into erratic spikes. "No, no, no," Paul muttered, his hands a blur as he worked to stabilize the patient. The rest of us stood frozen, our will to act smothered by the unfolding tragedy. The rift between our duty to the individual and the safety of the collective had never felt so wide, so insurmountable. As the emergency siren blared, its shrill cry a stark reminder of our reality, we realized the intervention had backfired. The virus, a cunning adversary, had not been fooled by our attempts at healing. In that moment, the Europa base was no longer a sanctuary, but a trap, the walls closing in with the promise of a peril that was both intimate and expansive. The tragic cliffhanger of our story loomed overhead, a silent specter that watched as we grappled with the conflict between our duty and our survival. As the night drew in and the Europa base settled into a restless slumber, the struggle within us raged on, a tempest of duty and survival that promised no easy answers. The stars outside, once symbols of our quest for knowledge, now glared back at us, cold and indifferent to the human drama below. Chapter 7: Breaking Point. Europa's relentless ice seemed to press against the very hull of our station, a constant reminder of the desolation outside. Inside, the once harmonious hum of machinery now sounded like a dirge for the unity we'd lost. We were quarantined, each of us an island adrift in a sea of encroaching despair. Kent stood by the command console, his silhouette rigid against the blinking lights. "We must stay the course," he asserted, his voice cutting through the murmur of discontent. "Our mission, our purpose here, demands it." Laura leaned against the lab counter, her arms folded, the skepticism clear in her stance. "Purpose. Kent, our purpose was exploration, discovery. What do we have now? We're caretakers of the dying." Jin sat at the communication station, her hands idle, the absence of Earth's voice rendering her expertise moot. "We can't even send a distress call," she said, her words tinged with a bitterness none of us had heard before. Paul, emerging from the infirmary, his face drawn from the vigil over our infected companion, joined the fray. "This isn't about exploration anymore. It's about survival. If we don't," he was cut off by a voice from the back, one we had seldom heard rise above a whisper. It was John, his countenance a mask of endurance that his recent brush with death had forged. Survival means making choices, hard choices. Maybe it's time to think about taking control ourselves. A stunned silence followed his words. Mutiny was a concept so alien to our disciplined minds that it crackled in the air like static. Kent's blue eyes locked onto John's. Are you suggesting we abandon the chain of command? Our duty? John's gaze didn't waver. I'm suggesting we do whatever it takes to get out of this alive. If that means taking matters into our own hands, so be it. The idea hung in the air, a specter more chilling than the cold of Europa's surface. The notion that our tightly knit crew could unravel to the point of rebellion was an attestation to the strain we were under. Laura's voice broke the tension. John has a point. Kent, your orders aren't keeping us safe. They're keeping us tethered to a sinking ship. I could see the conflict play out across Kent's face, the struggle between maintaining order and acknowledging our dire straits. Without order, we have nothing, he countered, his baritone voice strained. Jin rose to her feet, her locket glinting in the sterile light. What we have is each other. If we can't trust in that, what's left? The debate spiraled, voices rising and falling in a discordant symphony of fear and frustration. Accusations were hurled, alliances formed and dissolved in the span of breaths. The fabric of our crew, once seamless, now showed the wear of our ordeal. As the hours passed, the station felt smaller, the walls of vice that threatened to crush us under the weight of our dwindling options. The sense of being trapped, both physically and by circumstance, was a mire that pulled at our feet, at our spirits. I found myself at the viewport, staring into the unyielding expanse of ice and stars. The beauty of this place, which had once filled me with awe, now seemed a cruel joke. We were explorers who had ventured too far, and the price of our ambition was etched in the lines of my crewmates' faces. As I turned back to the group, the tension of our tragic situation was a palpable force. We were at a breaking point, a precipice beyond which lay the unknown. The prospect of mutiny, once unthinkable, was now a seed planted in the fertile ground of our desperation. Sleep was elusive that night, and I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the station as it settled against the ice. The conflict and struggle of our plight were a chorus that played on repeat in my mind, a tragic cliffhanger that promised no respite, no easy answers. The gravity of the unknown had never felt so oppressive, so inescapable. Chapter 8. The Fall of Maxwell. Europa's icy surface crackled beneath the station's weight, a constant reminder of the desolate and frozen world just beyond our walls. The cold had seeped into every crevice, every corner, until it seemed to become a part of us, a relentless chill that we could not escape. It was in this frigid silence that we faced our darkest hour. Paul's quarters were a sharp distinction to the chaos that had enveloped the rest of the station. The room was meticulously organized, with medical texts aligned perfectly on the compact shelf and his old-fashioned wristwatch resting atop the desk, its ticking a soft heartbeat in the stillness. His absence was a void that no amount of scientific understanding could fill. Kent stood at the threshold, his commanding baritone reduced to a whisper. He can't be gone. Not Paul. He was our rock. Laura, her blonde hair a halo in the dim light, her glasses slightly askew, rifled through Paul's notes scattered across the desk. His research, its half-finished sentences, thoughts trailing off. How do we pick up where he left off without him? Jin, her brown eyes downcast, clutched her locket tightly. We knew the risks coming here, but this, her voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. John leaned against the wall, his rugged features pulled tight with grief. We're not just losing people. We're losing pieces of our chance to get out of this. I shuffled my feet, the sound shockingly loud in the silence. Paul wouldn't want us to give up. We have to keep going. For him, for all of us. Kent ran a hand through his brown hair, the gesture one of frustration and loss. But how? He was the only one who truly understood the medical side of this mission. Without him, Laura closed Paul's journal with a soft thud, her hazel eyes meeting Kent's. Then we learn. We have his notes, his books. It's not the same, but it's something. But what if it's not enough? Jin's question hung in the air, a specter more haunting than the omnipresent cold. It has to be, John said firmly, pushing away from the wall. We can't let fear paralyze us. Paul fought until the end. We owe it to him to do the same. The conversation continued, each of us grappling with the grim reality that a cure might indeed be beyond our reach. We were astronauts, scientists, explorers, not doctors. The weight of Paul's absence bore down on us, a heavy burden that threatened to crush our already faltering spirits. As we left Paul's quarters, the station seemed to echo with the ghost of his presence. His medical bay, once a flare of healing and hope, now stood as a tombstone to our dwindling chances. In the common area, the tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken fears and the rising conflict of our continued struggle for survival. We gathered around the table, a makeshift council in the midst of our disintegrating order. "We can't let this break us," Kent said, his voice steady, but his blue eyes betraying the turmoil within. "We need to focus on what Paul left behind, his knowledge, his determination." "We'll divide the research," Laura suggested, her assertive tone a lifeline in the uncertainty. "Each of us takes a part, studies it. We pool our information." The plan was a frail raft in the storm, but it was all we had. We agreed, each of us taking a stack of Paul's notes, a piece of his legacy, in the hopes that we might find the key he had been searching for. The days that followed were a blur of figures and medical jargon, of experiments and tests that seemed to lead nowhere. Our every effort was a confirmation to Paul's influence, but the shadows that crept along the edges of our morale were a constant reminder of the tragic cliffhanger that was our existence. The station, a confirmation to human ambition and ingenuity, now felt like a cage, and the silence that had once been a companion became a reminder of the voices we had lost. As I laid down to rest, the cold of Europa's embrace a chilling lullaby. The conflict and struggle of our survival followed me into my dreams, a relentless pursuit that promised no respite, no easy victories. The fall of Maxwell was not just a loss of life, it was a loss of hope, and as I drifted into sleep, I knew that the path forward was one we would have to carve out of the ice, out of the unknown, ourselves. Chapter 9. Trust Erodes. Europa's frost-laced surface was no longer just an alien landscape outside our windows. It had become a mirror to the chill settling among us. The Habitat module, once a sanctuary of scientific pursuit and shared dreams, now felt like a chamber where our trust in one another, worn thin by fear and loss, could shatter with the slightest tremor. Kent paced the length of the common room, his footfalls a steady drumbeat against the hum of machinery. "We can't turn on each other. That's exactly what's going to end us before the virus has a chance." Laura sat at the table, surrounded by stacks of Paul's notes, the dim light casting long shadows across her face. "We're not turning on each other. We're trying to survive. But with every tick of the clock, our chances are slipping through our fingers." Jin, her posture slumped in defeat, her hands absent-mindedly toying with her locket, spoke up. "What if Paul had found something, a clue, and we've just been looking right past it?" The spark of hope in her voice was a flicker of warmth in the cold reality of our situation. We gathered around Laura, who had spread the notes out like a map to an undiscovered country. John, standing by her side, pointed to a scribbled margin note. "Here, look. Paul mentioned a compound, something we haven't tried yet." The compound was a string of chemical names that twisted the tongue, a potential key to a lock we were not sure would turn. The debate that ensued was a torrent of words, each of us clinging to the raft of this new lead. "But we don't know what it does, not really," Kent argued, his voice a warning of caution in the tempest of our desperation. Laura's hands hovered over the notes, her eyes tracing lines of text as if they held the answers. "We have the equipment to synthesize it. It's a chance." A chance? Kent's skepticism was a tangible thing, a wall that rose between hope and pragmatism. Or is it a risk we can't afford to take? Jin interjected, her voice firmer than we'd heard in days. "Every breath we take in this place is a risk. Paul left us this path. We owe it to him, to ourselves, to follow it." The argument raged on, the fabric of our once unbreakable unity fraying at the edges. Accusations were cast like stones, paranoia weaving its way through our thoughts like a silent serpent. "We're not thinking straight," I finally said, my voice cutting through the noise. "We need to step back, look at this with clear heads." Kent stopped pacing, and all eyes turned to me. "What do you suggest? We take shifts," I proposed. "Some of us work on synthesizing the compound, while the others rest. If we're all exhausted, we'll make mistakes. Laura nodded slowly, the movement a reluctant agreement. All right, but we can't delay. Every moment we waste is a moment the virus is winning. The decision was made, a fragile consensus that held as much promise as peril. We split into teams, the station a beehive of activity as we set about our tasks with a renewed, if cautious, vigor. In the lab, the air was thick with the scent of chemicals and the undercurrent of anxiety that had become our constant companion. The specter of the virus loomed over us, an unseen foe that mocked our efforts. As we worked, the base seemed to groan under the strain, the metal creaking like the bones of a weary giant. The tragic cliffhanger of our survival tale was written in every line of code we entered, every test tube we filled. Night fell, or what passed for night in the endless dark of space, and we took our turns resting, though sleep was an elusive specter for some. The solitude of my bunk was a small comfort, the restlessness of my thoughts a reminder of the conflict and struggle that had become our norm. The potential lead in Paul's notes was a glimmer of light in the darkness, but the division it had caused among us was a crack in the foundation we had so carefully built. As I drifted into a fitful sleep, the question of whether we could trust in this new direction, in each other, was a heavy weight upon my chest. Trust was eroding, worn away by fear and the relentless pressure of our predicament. And as the station settled into a tense quiet, the icy surface of Europa, an ever-present backdrop to our ordeal, I couldn't help but wonder if our pursuit of knowledge had led us to a point of no return. Chapter 10. Harsh Choices. Europa's relentless embrace seemed tighter than ever, the cold of its surface seeping into the station's bones. The hum of life support systems was a monotonous lullaby, a reminder of the thin line between survival and the eternal sleep of the void. It was in this precarious balance that we faced the unthinkable. Kent stood at the head of the common room, the metal walls echoing the gravity of his words. We have to make a decision, and we have to make it now. Jin, her fingers nervously twisting her locket, faced him squarely. Leaving them behind is not a decision, it's a death sentence. Kent's jaw clenched, his athletic build rigid with the burden of command. It's about the greater good. If the infection spreads, greater good? Jin's voice rose, a crescendo of disbelief. Since when do we decide who's worth saving and who's not? I shifted uncomfortably, the recycled air filling my lungs like a leaden weight. The